morning and welcome to Spotlight. 1967 to 2017. It's been 50 years since the unrest that propelled Detroit into the international spotlight. When the 5 days of turmoil were done, 43 people were dead, thousands injured, and much of the Motor City was in shambles. Today, we take a look back to look forward. Our guests, Professor Herb Boyd, author Hubert Locke, historians Bob Bury and Marlo Stoudemire, and Action News journalists Carolyn Clifford and Dave Llewellyn. It's Sunday, July the 23rd. I'm Chuck Stokes, and this is a Spotlight special from theCUBE. Herb Boyd, he's originally from the city of Detroit. He is author, journalist, historian, and he's written a new book, a book called Black Detroit, A People's History of Self-Determination. Welcome back to the Motor City.
Chuck, it's good to be back.
It's so good seeing you again. It's been a long time, too long.
Too long, but I know your little sister.
You do. You're up in New York, she's up in New York,
Yeah,
and so you're in good company.
You dig it?
Well, thank you. Big week here. 50 years since 1967. You've written this wonderful book, great details, and I encourage everybody to read it. If you don't know anything about Detroit, by the time you read this, you'll know all you need to know about Detroit. But let's start with the chapter about 67. And I like the way you open it up with the song by John Lee Hooker. Okay, Detroit is Burning. But then right at the top, you say, in 1966, a small riot on Kercheval Street on the east side was a precursor to the major urban rebellion that rocked the city. All right, everybody's talking about 67.
Right.
But you go to 66, and I don't think a lot of people know about that. Talk about that and its significance.
You know, one of the things about any kind of cataclysmic aspect, you know, in a community, you know, people they zero in on that. But it's an accumulative process. You have to put it in historical and political perspective. And one of the things about that, you go back to 1943, the riot of 43.
Right.
That was
Which was the year you came to Detroit,
exactly right.
You were 4 years old?
Right, exactly, Chuck. The thing about that is that the Sojourner homes, the whole Sojourner Troop homes, had a situation there that was a precursor to the 1943 riot. So you have to kind of put it into perspective in terms of like some of the incidents that preceded the actual explosion itself.
And I noticed that you called it rebellion.
Yes.
And there's always this debate. Should it be called riots, rebellion, unrest? What term are you most comfortable with and why as a Detroiter?
You know, I heard another one the other day, Chuck. Revolution.
Revolution, okay.
Revolution.
All right, a lot of R's.
I'm comfortable with rebellion because you're talking, as opposed to riot, because ordinarily when you say riot, it's kind of preceded by race, you know, a race riot, you know, in terms of the conflict between different groups, you know, different ethnic groups in the community. But this here didn't have that kind of tension. It was not black against white. It was almost black and white against the state. Got the oppression that all of us was experiencing, particularly the African-American community when it comes to the unemployment numbers, to talk about the housing situation, to say nothing about the educational process. You know, connected to the Kercheval thing was the walkout at Northern High School in 1966. So you had another element of it in terms of the kind of discontent that was simmering in the black community. And you add what you call the combustible aspect was police brutality, you know, because that's an ongoing situation going all the way back to the Big Four.
You talk about people like V. Lonnie Peake.
Oh, my goodness.
You know, who was a student at that time, was very much involved in some of that student organizing. Lonnie's still around, preaching from pulpits and doing all sorts of other. That is Reverend Peake. Reverend Peake. But you illustrate those type of individuals and what had occurred at that particular time. Let's kind of fast forward.
Sure.
You make your home in New York now.
Exactly.
Get back to see your mom and other relatives. But if you look at what's happening now, your thoughts. Could it happen again, and what do we need to do to make sure it doesn't happen again?
You know, one of the things about the '67 rebellion, we had some fairly prophetic visionary voices at that time, it could have been headed off. In the same way, if you go back to 1943 when we had Forrester B. Washington and John Dancy heading up the Urban League
right,
here.
That's right.
John Dancy had told him, they said it's a simmering discontent out there, you better do something about it, because he had his hand on the pulse of what was happening in the black community. Conrad Mallett Sr. had a similar kind of disposition and told Mayor Kavanaugh at that time, we get ready for a possible explosion. And if he'd have heeded,
and Kavanaugh, who was considered to be one of the liberal politicians in America.
So the whole Kennedy thing in terms of the Great Society and the New Frontier and model cities and the TAP program and Head Start, all of those things gave them his feeling of optimism that, Detroit won't happen like was in Watts, or Newark, because you understand that 2 weeks before Detroit's explosion, there was one in Newark, New Jersey. And of course the fatalities there was not like what we had in Detroit, but it's often connected. And I think it's important to see how the '67 rebellion, you have to put it in kind of a national context too. What was happening otherwise, the kind of overarching aspects in terms of the socio-economic dynamic.
Right, all right. Herb, this is a great way to get people's interest. We're going to continue our spotlight interviews. I'm going to continue a conversation with Herb Boyd over on WXYZ.com. We encourage you to click over. As soon as Spotlight is over, listen to that. We're going to be talking about people like Ron Lockett with the Northwest Activity Centers, who's written a piece for this book, and why Herb Boyd started his book in 1701, not in 1967. We'll be right back. When Spotlight returns, a former aide to the Detroit Police Commissioner, he's also an author and professor, Hubert Locke. Hubert Locke, one of my guests today on Spotlight. He is the author of The Detroit Riot of 1967, and he's come back home from Seattle, Washington. Welcome back to Detroit.
Mr. Stokes, thank you very much.
It's our pleasure. Riot or rebellion, which term are you most comfortable with?
Well, I'm not comfortable with rebellion at all.
Why?
It's because the people themselves who participated in it didn't think of it as a rebellion. There were 7,000 plus people who were arrested over the course of that week. Many of them were interviewed early on and were asked, why did you participate in this business? And the almost uniform answer was, we don't know. Everybody else was doing it.
Follow the leader.
Follow the leader, exactly. It was only a couple of weeks or a month after the chaos was over that people began to develop this ideological explanation for what had taken place. And it's one that I think the facts simply don't fit.
The biggest difference between 1967 and 2017.
The city was in those days going through a process of deindustrialization, and we really didn't realize how devastating that process was going to be on the life and culture of Detroit.
Automotive plants closing?
Absolutely. Plants could turn out the same number of cars with half the workforce that they had in prior decades.
You at that time were on the police commissioner staff. You were the only African American.
That's correct.
After what happened, you had to stand out like a sore thumb, right?
Well, I stood out like a sore thumb before it began.
Before it began, too.
And there wasn't much news to me. There were two of us who were appointed as assistants to police commissioners in major cities. One was Herman Goldstein, who's much better known and for much better reasons, who was police assistant to the commissioner of police in Chicago. Both of us came from academic backgrounds and from academic positions, and it was part of the attempt of policing in the 1960s to see if it could get on top of some of its worst problems. The problem of what we euphemistically called police-community relations in that era, and what was more baldly put as police brutality being one of the chief ones.
From the police perspective, what should they be concerned with? What lessons learned that they need to be attuned to now to make sure that a 67 doesn't happen in their community or even here again?
Well, I think there are two things, both of them highly controversial, Mr. Stokes, but I certainly don't mind talking about them. One is that we have been selecting, in my judgment, from the wrong major employment pool for police officers in today's society. It's still commonplace to hire large numbers of ex-military personnel as police officers. And think about it for a moment. You put men in the armed forces or the Marines, etc., teach them how to kill, and then deploy them overseas in military zones, something that has to be done for the defense of the nation, to be sure. But then if you bring those same chaps home at 23, 24, 25 years old, hire them in police departments, and say you've got to go around now and be nice to people, it simply doesn't wash. It simply doesn't work. The other is that there are still too many cities who actually balance their budgets on the back of police behavior. Who consider the amount of revenue that they gain from police writing traffic tickets and from fines for traffic offenses that are levied in the local courts. Once again, a major source of irritation in communities, both black and white, for that matter. I think until we deal with those two problems, we're going to continue to have problems.
As you watch how the media has perhaps changed and social media is so important these days, any advice to my profession?
Well, I think that we have to have more people like you, which we didn't have 50 years ago, let me hasten to add. Because how this gets interpreted is how all these changes, in fact, and developments get interpreted to the public is critical for the extent to which they will be accepted and built upon. And I just think it makes a world of difference when we have African American journalists and reporters who can tell the story as they see it, and needless to say, their perspective is often much different from that of white journalists.
As you come back and you visit Detroit, are you optimistic about where this city is headed?
Far more optimistic than I was, say, 20 years ago. I think Detroit is not simply on the mend, it's on the move. And I think it's moving in the right direction. Still enormous problems to cope with, but I think driving down here from 6 Mile and Woodward and just seeing developments, particularly here in the downtown area, that I didn't see 20 years ago, that's a very hopeful sign.
All right. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today on Spotlight. We're glad that you updated your book, and it's available at Wayne State University and several other places, but Wayne State University Press is the one that reprinted this, and so we want to thank our folks just down the road from here.
You're very kind. Thank you, sir.
And coming up, we'll talk to the historians that have been involved in this project for the last 5 years. We'll be right back. Joining me now on Spotlight is Bob Bury. He is president and CEO of the Detroit Historical Society. Bob, welcome back to Spotlight.
Great to be here, Chuck. Thanks.
All right, we clearly know now what happened in 1967. But let's fast forward 50 years later. Why is it important to tell this story again?
Well, you know, Chuck, that was a big decision that we made, and we decided that, you know, we had a couple of choices. We could either forget about it and hope everyone else did, and I think everyone knows that's not been the case.
That has not been the case.
We could let somebody else tell the story. And, you know, from where I sit, if you look at, with you excluded, of course, the media and folks that have told Detroit stories in the past perhaps didn't do the best job. So we knew.
So it was a gamble as to whether or not we should tell our own story, and if we didn't tell it, then we clearly left the door open for others to tell it, and they may not have done it in a way that would have pleased us or that would have been fair and comprehensive.
Well, that's right. And if the Detroit Historical Society decided to do it alone by themselves, that wouldn't have been right either, because this story is so big, it took all of us. Because the story that's told in the exhibition was formed by over 500 oral histories that we've collected. People, young, old, black, white, rich, poor, people that were there, or people that are just living with the legacy of what happened that helped tell that story. So it's very comprehensive, very diverse, and very inclusive.
This is not a one-day anniversary flash in the pan. That exhibit will be there for 3 years.
Well, that's right. And what we've seen so far in the month we've been open so far, it'll be a month today, actually, an amazing amount of people who are just curious or were there and look back and reflect on some of the things that did occur, some of the good things that have happened in the last 50 years, but importantly, we also look forward to what do the next 50 years look like, and how do we do things perhaps a little differently, more of this, less of that, whatever, to make sure that this community, we see the great potential and momentum outside our window. How do we keep that going?
A sidekick with you on this has been Marlo Stoudemire. You guys have been a 1-2 punch. Marlo, the community is a key element in all of this. It all started with the community, and 50 years later, we're still hearing that what happens in the neighborhoods is going to be very important to where Detroit is headed.
Yeah, you can't talk about Detroit, its past, its present, or its future without the people in it. I mean, it's the soul of the community. You know, one of the things that Bob and I always talk about is that it takes all of us to tell that story. And so if we're truly going to take control of our narrative, it starts with the people who live it every day. And this isn't just people in the neighborhoods that you think about. This is all layers of the community, from business, grassroots, corporate, even little Johnny sitting on his front porch. Everybody deserves a say in what we're talking about.
What was the biggest challenge in a 5-year-long process of getting this ready for this anniversary, but then making sure that it goes far beyond this anniversary?
I would say the biggest challenge is that you meet people where they are. Everybody's not at the same place when you have that conversation. Some people are ready for the conversation, some people need more information, and others are going to go kicking and screaming. And so what we had to do was really launch a very grassroots perspective, having dedicated support to go and knock on doors, making sure that Bob and I engage people at different levels, and really trying to bring everybody together across the last 2 years so we can get ready to talk about how we move forward and where the opportunities are.
Throughout this whole process, looking back to look forward, what do you anticipate, what do you hope 20 years from now? What impact do you think this should have had in the role that Detroit's going to be in then?
Well, the first thing that we had to recognize is that we had to bring everyone together who had different levels of expertise around critical imperatives of economics.
Create the dialogue.
Create the dialogue, but bring the subject matter experts to the table. Youth, neighborhoods, race, economics, right? And so having over 100 community partners was key to preparing people to connect to activities and things that are already moving Detroit forward. Our hope is 20 years, 50 years from now, history tells a different story on how we were able to make some decisions by being informed on our history to do things differently.
Marlo, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
And coming up, I'll head back to our Southfield studio. I'll sit down with my colleagues, Carolyn Clifford and Dave Llewellyn. All of us will be involved in an important town hall meeting later this evening. Get ready for that Detroit 2020 town hall meeting and our conversation in just a sec. And welcome back to Spotlight. We're obviously in Southfield now with my colleagues, Carolyn Clifford and Dave Llewellyn. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, happy to be here.
All right, what's on tap for later this evening?
Well, tonight, you know, we're going to have the television premiere of the Detroit Free Press documentary film, 12th and Claremont. And Channel 7, of course, glad to be part of the film. You know, we gave some of our footage.
Magazine, kind of the three together.
Absolutely. And so the film will air from 7 until 8:15. And after that, we're going to have our third town hall meeting, and it'll be right here at Broadcast House. And we're excited to have a group of people talking about the documentary film.
A diverse group who will join us in the studio to discuss what they've seen and what they remember and where we are today, 50 years after this largest of the rebellions, the riots during this period of time.
And you know, it's a film that will evoke emotions, I think, from right to left and everywhere in between, depending on who you are, what your own personal history is. This film is going to make you think, whether you were around in '67 or you weren't around in '67.
I'm the youngest of 9, but I've heard so many stories about what happened back then from my mom, from my brothers and sisters.
Grew up in Detroit, for those who don't know.
Grew up right in the city of Detroit, and so it was definitely a history lesson for me. But I think in doing all of our stories, I've definitely learned that depending on where you lived in the city of Detroit, whether you lived in the suburbs, and who was around you, that's how you were impacted by the 1967 riots. A lot of people didn't even experience it at all, but if you were in the middle of Detroit and you were there, I mean, it impacted you in a different way, for sure.
Dave, all of us have done tons of interviews through the years, lots of different stories. I can't think of a topic or a story that has had more impact on the image, the psyche, and the financial wherewithal of this region throughout the year, and then we're trying to look forward with that.
Yeah. Well, even if you go back to the site of 12th and Claremont where the riots began, and you see what isn't there today that was 50 years ago. Now, Gordon Park is there today, and the city has spent money to make that even more attractive and enjoyable than it was before. And so that certainly is changed, but the neighborhood around it, you know, stores were looted, burned, never rebuilt, you know, all these years later. So it is a lasting impact. But despite that, you know, 50 years later, we're seeing tremendous growth and redevelopment in areas of the city. And in fact, there's a plan for that neighborhood where there is tremendous hope now with developers that that neighborhood is going to change for the better again.
It's interesting. So many people are interested in Detroit right now. We really are the comeback city. So they not only want to hear what happened in Detroit 50 years ago, but of course they want to hear what's going forward now and how we are bringing it back.
All of our stories that we've done over the last 6, 8, 10 weeks are online, and certainly the Facebook Live is an important component of telling the story as well, and we'll be there.
And we hope you join us this evening right here on WXYZ Channel 7. We will be on air, online, and we hope you join us next week right here on Spotlight. I'm Chuck Stokes. Have a great week.